Good morning. Hope you're all feeling refreshed, well fed from the breakfast, ready to roll after a very busy, packed, informative day yesterday, and a fun banquet. It's very delicious food, which was very nice. The field track today is going to run until 4:15, and then we're going to rejoin with the contraceptive track back in the theatre on the other side. So we'll be here to 4:15, and then we'll tootle over there and join in for one sort of general session together. So in this room today, we're going to be focusing on implementation in the field. We'll be covering quite a breadth of subjects, including the future for intratesticular approaches, marking, ethics, population management, part 2 of lessons from the field. But I'd like to start by thanking Best Friends Animal Society for sponsoring the entire field track today. It's really wonderful to have their support for today, but actually also their support and active involvement in much of ACC&D's work throughout the year. And much of that involvement is made possible by their CEO Emeritus, Gregory Castle, who we are also lucky to have on our ACC&D board. Many of you will know Gregory. He has this naturally strategic mind and a really deep compassion for animals, which makes him a very valued asset on our board. We're very pleased to have him with us. And he's offered to kick off our day today by setting the stage for non-surgical fertility control. So I'd like to invite Gregory, come up to the table here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and thank you for everyone. I hope you've had a good night and weren't so excited by all the news we heard yesterday and all the information we got that you couldn't get to sleep. I wasn't that excited. Well, I was excited, but I could get to sleep. So anyway, I'd like to just do a little bit of introduction to Best Friends and the work we're doing, and this will, I believe, set some context for the rest of the day. That's my intent anyway. And for those of you who don't know very much about Best Friends, I'll just give a sort of thumbnail sketch, my elevator speech of what we're all about. The organization was started by a group of animal lovers, more than 20 of us actually, in 1984. We were shocked at that time when we first went to a local humane society, a small one in Arizona, which was where we were living, to learn a little bit more about what was happening in those kind of places, shelters, municipal shelters, humane societies. And I think this was, when I say we were shocked, we were really as ignorant as many people are these days, actually, about what the number of animals that are dying in shelters, healthy animals, treatable animals, and it seemed like an absolute travesty to us, so we wanted to do something about it. So we began to take the animals from the shelter and find homes for them ourselves. We wound up with actually quite a large number of animals in our own homes. I think my height was 19 cats, 5 dogs, 3 birds, and other animals were not labeled or counted. So I did wonder at that time whether I was a hoarder at heart, but actually decided that I wasn't, because I didn't have any resistance to getting these animals into great homes. And now we built, really lucky enough, anyone who's visited our sanctuary in southern Utah knows what an incredibly beautiful place it is. It's in a red rock canyon. It's really has incredible, gorgeous views, and it's a wonderful place to do it. Wasn't a very intuitive decision to set up there, because it was actually labeled in the 60s before they built the dam at Page, Arizona, as I think the most remote part in the lower 48. So to set up an adoption center in a place where there were no people was not quite the most sensible thing to do. However, it's actually turned out rather well, and we have now built this to be a national organization. We have about 800 employees all over the country, and half of whom work there. And about 30,000 visitors come to see us every year. So we actually have made this work. right from the start, we were based on the idea of no-kill. No-kill was not a concept that was particularly familiar, or maybe even the term hadn't been coined at that time. But what that translated into, or the way we define that really now, actually it's not a good word to be a definition, but it's a benchmark of 90% of the animals that come into a shelter or an organization are saved. The 10% remaining, in many cases, not necessarily all, but in many cases are genuine cases of euthanasia, and we do make a distinction between using that term euthanasia and actually talking about animals being killed. Euthanasia is not an erroneous term for animals that are totally healthy, could find a home, but just haven't been able to be placed in a home. At that time, really what our mission turned into, or could be practically translated into, is saving those animals from being killed in the shelters and humane societies where that is practiced. So that is the focus of our work now, and it's concentrated on dogs and cats, although when we've solved the problem of dogs and cats, we intend to go to other species and probably other countries. It's confined now to the United States. At that time, there were 17 million, approximately, estimated animals dying in shelters every year. During the time between now and then and now, that number has been reduced to about 1.5 million. That is an astonishing achievement, actually, in a bit over 30 years. But it's still a tragedy that there's that many animals that are dying in shelters, and that's what we address primarily. We felt that 2 years ago we made a public announcement that Best Friends was committed to the idea of saving all those animals and ceasing having the practice of healthy animals being killed in shelters by 2025. This is a really kind of bold and stretched goal, but we felt it was possible. And the reason we felt it was possible was because of the increase in consciousness, the momentum that has been behind this movement, and the really large number of people. There's a lot of elements to this. The large number of private organizations which have been formed, many of them very small, but nonetheless are playing a part in saving those animals. And really, we have a network of private organizations and also it does include municipal shelters and humane societies who are committed to this goal. We have a network of more than 3,000 organizations around the country who we support in a variety of ways and who are committed to achieving this. So building that network and also changes in mentalities amongst those people, not all by any means, but many of the people who run and work in shelters and humane societies around the country, who have come to be committed to the goal of no-kill in these terms, has given us confidence and has built a momentum behind this whole movement, which we feel it is possible to achieve by 2025. We have detractors. It's not everyone who believes as we do. But one thing which we've noticed over the years is that as the momentum builds towards this and more communities reach the point where they are saving 90% of the animals that come into their care, that momentum brings other people on board, and it makes people participate in ways where they see it's possible, where they see how to do it, they see the techniques that are used in order to save those lives. There are actually now more than 2,000 no-kill, by this definition, saving more than 90% of lives. More than 2,000 communities in the United States that have reached that point. There are many more. There are communities by this definition. There are tons of them. I don't even have the exact number, but so there's still plenty of work to be done. But many of the challenges which have to be met in order to achieve this solutions have been found to them. Just to give you some examples, the dogs, in the case of dogs, I'm sure you're all familiar that in many, many shelters there are a lot of pit bull terrier type dogs. Whether they're actually pit bull terriers or not is kind of not significant, because they're seen as being that, and they're seen as having the reputation which actually has been encouraged, that they're dangerous dogs and they're difficult to manage and all of that. That is emphatically not true. We campaign against and promote legislation against breed discrimination in this way, although we acknowledge that there are certainly dangerous dogs, and some of them are pit bull terriers, but many of them are other breeds as well. And so our basic principle behind this is to judge each animal according to its characteristics, its personality, and its history, and so on. And certainly that needs to be taken account of. However, there are various techniques which have been developed in shelters and in organizations which house these dogs to care for them, and to socialize them and to train them. And all of those procedures are ones which have resulted in things like getting a lot of those dogs together in playgroups, showing the public that they can act like normal dogs, having fun together, not automatically fighting or whatever. I mean, one of the techniques we have used is to actually embed some of our staff members in shelters where there are a large number of these dogs. They need help. And just to give you one example, in our home state of Utah, the largest municipal shelter in the state is Salt Lake County Animal Services. And they had a problem. They had more than 40% of their dogs were pit bull terrier type dogs, which were seen as dangerous. We embedded a staff member in that shelter for a couple of years. This was about 3 years ago, I think it started. And they went from saving only 40% of those animals to now having sustained for 2 years a save rate for those type of dogs of over 90%. That was through training, it was through socialization, it was through various techniques like playgroups. And, you know, that's just one example of how solutions can be found to these kind of problems. Just to cover the species, on the cat front, I think 2 principal techniques have been developed, and not by any means only by best friends, but we are certainly at the core of it. Community cat programs which involve return to field, where animals are humanely trapped, often in coordination. Usually they work best if they are in coordination with the local animal control shelter. Trapped, taken to the shelter, but they're not really admitted to the shelter. They go into the hands through a partnership with a private organization who take care of the spaying and neutering, of vaccinations, and then returning them to the place where they were found. This has resulted in dramatic reductions in the number of animals that are killed in shelters. Within one of the principal cities in which this was started was Jacksonville, Florida. And within 2 years, they were killing in the region of 4,000 fewer cats every year through this technique. Very fast results. Another technique which is used is that of kitten nurseries, where kittens, particularly neonatal kittens, have been perhaps abandoned by their mother, need special care, need feeding every 2 hours at the early stages of life, and those were animals which were dying in large numbers in shelters before the establishment of kitten nurseries to care for them. Very labor intensive, a lot of volunteers, people are willing to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and spend 2 or 3 hours feeding them. Not always easy, but it's been done. It's been done in many different places, and it showed a lot of ability. My point really is that solutions have been found to these particularly difficult problems, and really just need to be spread. And of those 2,000 communities, they're not all sort of small communities with small numbers of intake. They include places like, which are either at or on the verge of reaching that 90% benchmark: New York City, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, Tucson, Portland, Albuquerque. These are just some examples of some major cities which have achieved this result. So we strongly believe that this is possible, and it's really a matter of many people believing in it, working hard to achieve it. And one final technique I'd just like to mention, there are others, but is the transport of animals from areas where there is a proliferation of, say, certain breeds or just dogs and cats, to animals in other parts of the country where there's actually becoming a shortage. Both the Northeast and the Northwest are areas which are ahead of the game here, and there is actually a shortage of particularly puppies and small dogs in those areas, and even cats, which, when I say even cats, it seems like cats are just everywhere, but there are some places where it's tough to find a cat in a shelter, believe it or not. There's one thing, though, I'd like to say about all of that, which is that we're really dealing with symptoms of the problem. There's a question about sustainability of this whole effort, and the amount of dedicated and committed and I can almost say over-the-top work that is needed in order to achieve this is real questions as to whether it's sustainable in the long term. So our vision of where this can go, and this I'm reaching now a little bit, probably maybe quite a lot, although in some areas not a lot, into the future, is that shelters can be transformed into operating in a different way, where the term we're using to describe them is animal resource centers, where they provide resources to the community, to pet owners, to people who maybe don't have all the experience or the knowledge to care for their animals as well as they could. Things like educating people to when we talk about education, a lot of people use the term humane education, and it usually means teaching kids how to care for animals. Our feeling is that is a long-term prospect. It's certainly valuable, but a more effective way of dealing with training kids is for that to be done by their parents. So these kind of resource centers could provide an ability to train people how to train their kids to look after animals better. As an example, other things which could be included in this, well, there's one major concept also which I haven't mentioned yet on this, which is reducing the numbers of animals that enter the shelters in the first place. Of course, there's always going to be a need on this. There's going to be strays which are picked up. There's going to be people who really have no other solution. But at the moment, most shelters are regarded by most members of the public as a sort of dumping ground for animals, where other solutions aren't maybe even considered. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, and probably this is totally uncountable, but tons of people get their pets from friends, from family, without involving a shelter in any way. But at the same time, tons of people also just regard a shelter as a place where you can just take an animal any time. They'll automatically take that animal, and it contributes to this requirement to find homes for large numbers of animals. We'd like to see that change. We'd like to see solutions, and are working on solutions, for instance, using technology to place animals, rehome animals, without them even ever entering the shelter. There's a lot more to this concept, but it's basically transforming the way in which shelters are seen by members of the public and the activities which they do. Spaying and neutering, I should get to that. It's obviously a very key part of all of this, and that would certainly be something which these animal resource centers would do in affordable and accessible ways. And we heard a lot about, I'm getting my 1 minute sign here, so I've got to wrap up here. But just briefly, we heard a lot yesterday from Kathy in particular about the sort of challenges that are faced in the future as far as this is concerned. But I'd like to add one more, which wasn't really highlighted in that, which is that there is a kind of conservatism amongst animal welfare folks. It applies, I think, both to shelter personnel, but also to the private individuals who are very, very particular about making sure that animals who have been sterilized are totally sterilized, and preferably for good, not for a limited period of time. And I think we've already seen with Zooterin that there is a reluctance to embrace Zooterin on the basis that it's not as final as surgical spaying and neutering. That is something which I think we're going to have to address as we go forward in the future, and as any methodology, compounds or whatever it is, to non-surgically sterilize, that level of acceptance is going to be a challenge which we will have to face, which we, in a sense, are already facing. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind. I'm not in any way being pessimistic about the possibilities here. I'm very encouraged by the fact that there are so many people who are interested in working on this. But when it comes to be something which is possible and established, I think we're going to have to overcome some resistance and reluctance on animal welfare people's parts. So that's kind of a very brief survey of the scene from my perspective, and I hope that provides some context for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.